And good morning, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to what is for us a real milestone, our 40th annual Economic Outlook Seminar. The seminar this year is presented by Northwestern Energy and by the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. My name is Chuck Keegan. I'm retired Forest Industry and Manufacturing Director in the Bureau, and I'm going to be moderating today's program. We're going to begin this morning with the official welcome from the University of Montana, and to do that we're extremely pleased to have the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs from the University. Would you please welcome Perry Brown.
Thanks, Chuck. So let me say welcome to everybody. We're glad you're here. I think this is a fitting day for us to talk about energy. You're part of the transition team to get us ready for all the energy that will be on campus on Monday. So you're helping us move in that direction right now, bringing your energy to this conference and your ideas. And we're going to have a full house come Monday, and people will be running all over town, hopefully spending some of their money here. Anyway, on behalf of President Engstrom, who is stuck in Washington, D.C., only stuck because he's got work to do, but not because of weather or anything, and myself, let me just welcome you to the University of Montana. We're very happy to have the Economic Summit on campus this year. We think this is a good place to have it, and we're glad that the organizers placed it here this year. And certainly before classes start, there are good parking opportunities. If we waited a couple days, it'd be a problem, but no, this is good. So you're going to have hopefully a really good time, certainly a very informative time today. There's a lot to talk about the state's economy as a whole, and then the individual sectors that we'll hear updates on. You know, things like agriculture and manufacturing and health and tourism and other topic areas. And then later on this morning, we'll have a very, very special session on energy in Montana and the things that are going on. And I think it'll be really enlightening for all of us to hear and to see what's going on in this state in that particular area. So, on behalf of the university, let me just welcome you to the University of Montana. I hope it's a good day for everybody. I'm sure it will be. There'll be a lot of information, a lot of things to take away from here. So I'll turn it back to Chuck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Perry, for that great start. And I will say, as part of the University of Montana, we're delighted to bring these Outlook seminars to you and to bring them around the state. By way of some further introduction this morning, let me give you a bit more background on our Bureau for those of you who may not be familiar with us. The Bureau of Business and Economic Research is the research arm of the University of Montana's School of Business Administration. The Bureau was begun in 1948 and since then has been involved in a wide variety of activities, including economic analysis and forecasting, survey research, and of course what we're about today, information dissemination. We also publish the Montana Business Quarterly, to which many of you now subscribe, and you'll find some additional information on our Bureau on some of the publications we have available here, and also I'd direct you to our website, and I would invite you to contact us if we can be of any assistance to you or your organization. As you can see, we have a number of sponsors, and they're really essential to the success of our seminars. I'd like to thank them and take a minute to recognize our sponsors. First of all, our principal Outlook sponsor is Northwestern Energy. Our statewide Outlook sponsors are First Interstate Bank, BNSF Railway, Pacific Steel and Recycling, and Benefice Health Systems. And then in the Missoula area, we have local sponsors. First of all, the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, and we have two local broadcast sponsors in Missoula. As you can see, the seminars are being videotaped by the Montana Community Access Television group as part of its media assistance grants program to nonprofit organizations, and the seminars are also being videotaped by the School of Business Administration. Also, the Montana Chamber of Commerce sponsors the booklet that you all have with the PowerPoints of the speakers, and they will be referring to these PowerPoints during their presentations, so I'd suggest you use that. Again, these sponsorships are one of the major reasons that we are able to bring our seminars around the state, and we greatly appreciate the support the sponsors give us, and I'd like to ask you all to join me in a round of applause for the sponsors. Well, as Perry mentioned, our theme this year is certainly a timely one, the new American energy revolution. On the energy front, in recent years, obviously we've seen enormous changes in consumption, in the production technology, and more recently, very dramatic changes in prices. And these changes have affected not just traditional fossil fuels, but also alternatives and renewables. And to deal with these changes, we are delighted to have as our keynote at lunch a person who has spent his career in the energy business, and he's going to share an insider's view of key parts of the energy revolution that is taking place. So make sure that you stay for our luncheon program. As always in our program, we're going to take an in-depth look at the Montana economy, at regional and local economies within Montana, and major industry sectors in the Montana economy. And in looking at the economy and its components, our speakers are going to do it with a view toward the impacts of this changing energy environment. As always, we've allowed time for questions after each presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would hold your questions until that time. So we want to begin our formal program with a look at, first of all, why we feel the theme is an important one to Montana, and then we're going to move into a look at global, national, and statewide economic conditions and forecasts. And to do that, I would like to introduce the Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Would you please welcome Pat Barkey?
Thanks and good morning. It's great to be on campus. I agree with the provost. We've put together our program this morning with a theme that we think is timely and important for all of us in Montana. And before I turn to the outlook, I'd like to just say a few words about our theme. It is energy, but more specifically, it's something that's come to be known as the new American energy revolution, because it truly is a revolution. Our keynote speaker, Bill Whitsitt, will address it during lunch. So many things have changed, it's hard to use any other word. And of course, we've been doing these seminars for a while too, and a lot of things have changed over the years, 40 years. Some things have changed. Some things haven't changed too much. We still have some of the same people on the program. They look a little different. They have a few different things to say. But we're pleased to have that consistency. But really, turning to energy, it's really stunning when you think over the period of time that 40 years ago we were all driving cars that collectively got 12.5 miles a gallon. And there's a lot more cars on the road today, but those cars are vastly more efficient, and that's having ramifications. When you look at the overall economy is many, many times larger today than it was in 1976, 40 years ago when these seminars started. But the kinds of things we produce, and more importantly, the efficiency, the energy efficiency in the economy is also has changed enormously. So you can see the amount of energy we use per dollar of economic output is less than half today of what it was in 1976. And then there's the things that are the byproducts of energy production. Pollution is one. And of course, there's always a lot more work to be done in protecting our environment. But when you look at some of the pollutants, 40 years ago we had acid rain. And while we still have, in this case, sodium dioxide emissions in the United States, you can see that by the measures that we have, those have been knocked down enormously. So we're a little cleaner. We're more efficient, even with our larger economy that we are today, and those have been really big changes. But that's not really the revolution. I mean, the revolution is something that's really much more recent, and that's why we're bringing it to your attention. So, for example, if you look at the number of miles that Americans drive, it's almost a birthright that we drive our cars. We drive more of them. We have more cars than drivers. And since 1911, roughly, we've been driving more every year until 2007. We're not driving more every year. As a matter of fact, the amount of collectively that we drive is plateaued. A big change. Crude oil production. Most of us know of the changes here. We know that crude oil production for a long time has been declining. The peak was in 1970. We know it's risen. But do you know by how much? That crude oil production in the United States is actually up 92% since 2008. A staggering change in terms of the path of the energy side of our economy. And of course, as you go to the Bakken, the revolution is all around you. So you go to places like Williston, North Dakota, and in a short span of time, you see on this graph, wages, average wages for all jobs have more than doubled. And then, of course, as our legislature meets, we look with envy across our eastern border to a state that once had very little in resource taxation, a state that's now collecting $3.2 billion a year from the production of their natural resources. A stunning change. But the changes aren't all in oil, and they're not all in the oil patch. In fact, the breadth of the changes are wider. One of them has been happening very slowly over time, and it's benefited communities like Missoula. Across the state, there is a program called the Treasure State Resource Endowment Program that's funded by the proceeds from coal severance taxes. And what this map is trying to show you is this small collection of counties in the blue, which are coal-producing counties, have over time paid into this fund, and those proceeds, the investment earnings from that fund, have funded projects you can see with these red dots all throughout the state, including Missoula, including all the counties we visit. So it's really something that's important for all of Montana. It's a big change, and that's why we're bringing it to your attention. And we really look forward to looking and learning more about this revolution as we go to our lunch and keynote. Let me turn now to the outlook. And, you know, forecasting is a funny business. Every time you think you have a handle on where things are going, something happens, and you end up tearing up the script. And the event this year is the sudden decline in crude oil prices. It's dramatic, and it's very important, and it's going to show up throughout this program. It's like a tidal wave sweeping across all facets of economic activity in Montana and statewide. But I don't think it should let us lose sight of other important economic developments that are happening. So let's start with the national and the global economy. Very quietly, but it's getting a little more noise, very quietly, the U.S. economy is closing out the year on a very strong note. The best 6-month performance we've seen since before the recession. I'm always coming here saying words like disappointing to describe the national economy, not using those words anymore. I think for the first time we're seeing the good news extend to small businesses. Small business confidence is back to where it was before the recession, and we're seeing more increased loan demand and more small businesses telling surveyors they intend to expand. I think the outlook changes, though, and this is another important development, is that when you move outside the United States, things are going the opposite direction. Canada just lowered their interest rates yesterday. Europe is going to start doing what we've been doing, you know, printing money. And the prospects for the global economy have dimmed, and that's important for us. And of course, we have this noise heard around the world, and it's reverberating. It's showing up in politics, it's showing up in economics, and that's, of course, the big decline in oil prices that are causing some real big movements. You know, really, when you look at the national economy, probably the best way to describe the changed perception of the national economy is to look at some old forecasts. I like to do this because it really reveals a lot. It summarizes a lot of information. So a year ago, this was the forecast for the trajectory of growth. So standing back at the beginning of 2013, forecasters were saying, as I was noting then, this year not so good, next year better. That was the common refrain. We've heard that year after year. Now we move a year forward, and what happened? Well, next year was better. 2014 came in right about at expectations, which is a change because we've had disappointment after disappointment. And now as we stand at the beginning of 2015, the forecast is unchanged. We're still forecasting over 3% growth, which is a considerable pickup in the national economy. Now the new developments is the expectation of some turbulence beyond 2015, questioning whether the U.S. economy can continue to grow more rapidly than the global environment. And you know, there's nothing like growth to solve your problems. A lot of problems, especially economic problems. I've been commenting here in the past about how the labor market remained sick. And it still has a ways to go, but I want to tell you, the tonic is working, and the tonic is economic growth. If you look at those growth bars, that's quarterly growth in net hiring in the U.S. economy, and you look after the recession, which of course is that big negative spike, after the recession, you total up all those quarterly growth rates, which are quietly getting stronger. We've got 10.5 million net new jobs in the national economy. That's a big deal, and they're not all part-time, low-quality jobs. We wish they were better, we always do, but if you look at the number of Americans who tell us that they have a part-time job, but they wish they had a full-time job, that number is still disturbingly high, but it's down 2 million from where it was at the depths of the recession. So there really is improvement, there's room to go, but I think this is something that's getting better. But the question is, how much can we continue to be an outlier, which we increasingly are? And I want to communicate that to you by taking a little tour of global growth around the world to show you just how much things have changed, because I think this is important for us in Montana as well as the national economy. So if you look at the world, let's start in 2007, which was the year the recession was just breaking, and look at growth. In the United States, it came in at less than 2%. Canada was about 2%. And then you can see these other developed, industrialized nations, the older, larger democracies with fully developed economies. You can see the growth in Europe. It's actually Europe and Japan were actually stronger than we were here in North America. That's where the old world was, if you will. The developing economies had a different trajectory, the so-called BRIC nations. Brazil, 6.1, Russia, 8.5, India, 9.8, China, 14.2. So we had very, very strong growth. And of course, this is the pattern that caused a lot of changes, a lot of things that we've taken for granted here in the United States and Montana, like high agriculture prices, high energy prices even. Then we hit the recession in 2009. In 2009, these bars are obviously going negative. That's what recessions are. And we saw the recessions. You can see the severity of those recessions on your booklet and on the graph. You can see the recession was more severe even in Europe and Japan. What happened in the developing economies? Well, it was a two-sided story. In Brazil and Russia, they had big recessions as well, particularly Russia, an energy exporter, as we know. But India and China still managed pretty strong growth. And this was one of the things that helped pull the world out of the recession. It's also one of the things that helped commodity prices recover so quickly after they plunged during the financial panic. But the important news is what's happening right now. And in 2014, the most current data, as I've indicated, show that the United States growth is starting to pick up. I think that number there, 2.2, actually will be revised. Expectation for 2015 is it'll come in about 3%. So pretty good growth in U.S. Canada's a little more of a question mark with oil. But the rest of the developed world, Europe and Japan, are laggards. They're hardly growing at all. And we've heard this a number of times, and this is the data that shows. But the big story is what's happening in the developing countries, the BRICS, because the BRICS have come apart, if you will. Brazil, practically no growth. Russia will come in at negative growth when we finally find out. That's a big change from 8.5% and 6% growth. There's a lot of people that live in those countries. The big story is what's happening in India and China. It's a matter of degree. Chinese growth, 7.6%. That's the lowest growth since the Tiananmen Square uprisings. That growth is expected to continue to erode. It's expected to come in 6% range in 2015. And people are saying that China may never get above 6% growth again. That's a huge change to the world we've been used to for the last 10 or 20 years. And that's why we're keeping track of it. So let me summarize on the U.S. I think on the U.S. it's a good news story. We've gotten to the point where job growth has been strong enough and durable enough that we're pushing into that sweet spot of an economic recovery where we have a self-sustaining cycle. We have job growth, which gives income growth, which gives spending growth, more demand for products, which leads to more production and more job growth. That's good. I think we're going to have a much stronger dollar. We're already seeing that. Weakness abroad, strength in some of the policies. That's good if you're traveling, not so good if you're trying to export. I think the combination of the stronger dollar and the fact that energy prices have moved down so strongly, it's going to be a very strange year for inflation. And we're going to see no inflation, basically. Could be a little bit negative. I think we're going to see higher interest rates as the Federal Reserve starts pushing those rates up later in the year. And then the question becomes, how much longer can we keep going? How much longer can we continue to outpace the world? We did it in the late 90s, but it didn't last too long. We had a recession in 01. What about Montana? This is a big change as well. Montana's got, I call, a more balanced but slower growth. I think the growth patterns across the state are starting to look more like they were 10 years ago, where you're seeing the West be the bigger grower, whereas for the last few years it's been the East. The commodity boom is absolutely over. We're done with rising commodity prices. They're going the other way. And the question, quite honestly, that I would pose to George Haynes, who's next on the program, is, are ag prices next? Because commodity boom has been declining prices. A problem not getting much ink in Montana, but is quietly becoming very important, is finding available workers for the job openings that we do have in Montana. We're hearing this much more loudly across the state. I think we have some growth in some of our important industries, and we'll hear about what's going on in tourism and rec in a moment from Kara Grau. And I think there's always been a lot of talk about what's the price point for the Bakken, what's the price point for the Bakken, when does it stop being profitable? We've reached it. Okay? Whatever it is, and there's probably more than one of them, it's out there, and for a lot of wells, it's happened, and we're seeing the changes. The big story, of course, is what's going on with gas, and I put this up because, you know, you don't need me to tell you that gas prices have come down. I mean, there's big signs, right? And wherever you go, there's a big sign, and so I've always thought that oil prices have kind of an outsized place in our psyche, but they've come down. I mean, if you look at the commodity indices for all energy, including natural gas and coal, and you look at what happened to prices, we're down to levels that we haven't seen since the financial panic, and of course those didn't last very long. What's less well known is on the non-energy side, and this is a composite of a whole lot of things, from food and metals and so forth. What's not really apparent in the headlines is that these prices are coming down as well. And it was a fairly orderly retreat, as you can see from this red line, until in the recent 3 quarters you can see that that's really accelerated. And that's a big deal for Montana companies, and that's brought all energy prices down as a whole. And this is good news for consumers, clearly. And much of the ink and much of the reporting has been on how much the dividend will be for consumers. How happy will businesses be, restaurants and everything? How happy will they be with the discretionary income that consumers has essentially been given back? And when you look at the fact that Americans spend $1.3 trillion a year on energy, when you lower the price, that's a lot of money. But what's not as clear is the investment side, because investments have a different dynamic, and it goes the other direction. First off, let me show you this graph. What I mean by this graph is to tell you that the oil field investments that are part of this new American energy revolution, just part of it, but a big part, have quietly consumed a larger and larger share of all investment in the entire U.S. economy. So a few years ago, it was 20%. 10 years ago, it was 15%. Today, oil field investments are 30% of all investments in the national economy. And so when prices go down, those investments are pulled back. What happens? Well, we don't really know. Every price decline is different. But there was a price decline in 2009. It was short-lived. And we did have an opportunity to observe what happened to investment. And what I'm showing you are just the results from a forecasting model, but they're based on that experience. And they show that when you count off the quarters that elapse after prices go down, you can see after about 6 to 8 quarters, so roughly 3 quarters to a year and a half to 2 year period, a little sooner than that, I guess, a year and a half, you can see that there's a lag, but there's a significant decline in mining and oil investments, and that's like, duh, of course, that's what we're talking about. But what I want to note to you is that there's a little bit of a timing, so those will really start to kick in midpoint of this year. What's less apparent is what happens to other forms of investment outside mining and oil. And it's not just a story of a dividend for businesses too. There's a lot of businesses that serve oil and gas production. And they're going to pull back their investment just a little bit as well. So the other side of the economy, it's a smaller piece. Consumer spending is clearly bigger than investment, but there will be some drag because unlike previous oil price declines that occurred maybe in the 80s, we produce a lot more of our own oil, so we're hurting ourselves a little bit, particularly here in Montana. Well, these developments have really changed the whole pattern of growth across the state. And I like to put up these kind of maps. I know they reproduce a little bit better on the screen than they do in your book. But let me explain what I'm talking about when I put these maps up. First off, this is just a quick snapshot of what's going on in growth according to the most recent data we have. The counties in red are the ones that are growing the fastest, and the turquoise one on my screen, what are they there? They're pretty close to turquoise. On the screen up there are the second fastest. In years past, all the red would be to the east, and all the slower ones would be to the west. That's changing. It's true that growth in Richland County, right in the middle of the oil patch, is still growing relatively fast. That's through the second quarter of 14, last data point. But we also have fast growth occurring in the west, particularly in southwest, in Bozeman, 6.4%. Madison, a much smaller county, 10% growth. And interestingly enough, you're seeing some ups and downs in the biggest county in the state, Yellowstone County, which actually suffered a small decline, according to the most recent data. What about the time path of this growth? Well, we have some incomplete, but nonetheless very good data on what's going on one component of Montana's economy, and that's wages and salaries. And when you look at the growth in wages and salaries corrected for inflation, you see a pattern that might surprise you. It might surprise a few legislators as well. We'll be talking to them about this next week. And that is a slowdown in growth. We've seen, even before the oil prices started coming down, a gradual slowdown, so we're seeing less than 2% growth in wages and salaries across the Montana economy. That's occurring for a number of reasons, but that's occurring mostly because of some maturation, some cost control, and some slowdown in the drilling that occurred in the oil patch even before the oil price decline occurred. The news on growth is, I put up a graph. I should be shot for putting up a graph like this. There's too much stuff on this graph. But I put it up anyway because, one, you got a book, but secondly, because it tells a story. It's a long list of industries, and what I wanted to show you is that there's more balance in the economy. So almost all of these bars, which are showing growth by industry for the most recent year that we have, almost all those bars are positive. We're seeing growth in healthcare, we're seeing growth in business services, we're seeing growth in retail, wholesale, et cetera. So it's really pretty broad growth. Exceptions here, the important ones are mining and government. All right, those are a little bit in retrenchment. But it's a much more balanced growth that we're seeing now in the Montana economy. In terms of the regional differences, Paul will tell us a little bit what's going on in Missoula and Ravalli counties, but when you look at the regional differences, you're seeing more balance as well. So when you measure the wage and salary growth, corrected for inflation last year, you're seeing growth in western counties. You're seeing growth in Missoula. You're seeing growth in Flathead. And of course, you're seeing big growth in Gallatin County, which is the fastest growing in the state. You're seeing a little less growth in Yellowstone and a little less growth in that rightmost bar, which is the rest of the state, which has historically been dominated by developments in the oil patch, but not so much. So Gallatin growth in 2014 was 40%. 40% of all state growth was in Gallatin County last year. So it's pretty amazing what's going on there. But you know, when you're looking at now what's going to happen in the outlook, we're really looking very closely, obviously, at what's going on in oil and gas. And what we notice is that a lot of oil and gas activity takes place outside the oil patch. So if you look at what's going on in wages and salaries in the oil and gas industry, and you look at it by the different subcomponents of that, drilling is a fairly small component. A big component is support services for the mining industry. A lot of this is contained in urban areas, some of them in North Dakota, some of them in Montana, places like Billings and Glendive and so forth. So that's something we're looking at very closely, because the pain is going to be felt beyond the areas where drilling takes place. So let's talk about a couple things, the outlook, and close with the outlook. I've already talked a little bit about energy and mining quite a bit. It's hard not to. They've quietly grown to become a much larger fraction of what we call the basic industries, the industries which drive the rest of the economy. They're, what is that, 23% now. And Terry will tell us, but I'm sure it's not going to be a mystery to know that there's significant declines in that industry, and that's important for the outlook. Haven't talked much about agriculture yet. And agriculture is a very important industry in Montana, and it's got a very big question mark out there, and I'm not sure George can answer it, but he'll try. I will say that it's been a tremendous run for agriculture. Is it over? It's not over yet, but there are some movements happening. But you know, as we put up this, these little pie charts and we talk about the various drivers of the Montana economy, I try to learn this word. It starts with an H. I think it's called humility. Forecasting actually teaches you that. There's a lot going on in the Montana economy that we're still struggling to understand. And in fact, I've been struck by the Governor's Main Street Montana project, looking at the various key drivers of the state economy as they see it. And one of those is technology and high tech. And this very short list of high-tech companies in Montana, some of which are in Missoula, many of which are not, they are included in our bottom line. We know what's going on with these companies because they're part of the big picture. But do we really understand what the drivers for these companies are? Do we really understand what their prospects are for the kinds of businesses they're in? I think not as well as we should, and so we're going to keep working at that to try to understand. So let me talk a little bit about the forecast. I think the outlook for the economy, as I mentioned, is more balanced but slower. Let me start out by saying how we thought growth was evolving last year. So last year, when we were speaking here, we thought 2012 was a really good year, and we thought 13 came in at 2.7, and we said 14 is going to be just like 13. So how do we do? Now, this is more humility here, right? Well, we got part of it right. 2013 was like 2014, but of course they changed the date on us, and they said 2012 was a little bit better, and 2013 they said was not nearly as good as we thought it was. So the data were revised, and 2014 was like 2013. We got that part right. But it wasn't as strong as we thought. 2014, there was simply too much going on. There were certainly some issues in ag with harvest. There were some issues with, obviously, with oil at the end of the year. And 2.1 is where we are. So from that new perspective, it looks like our 2015 forecast is an improvement. And it is. It's an improvement in growth from what we saw in 2014. So we think the economy is going to improve because we think construction is going to have a better year. We think we're going to see certainly manufacturing, high tech. There's a lot of key parts of the Montana economy are doing well, and you'll hear about those in a minute. But that 2.8 is lower than what we forecast last year. We thought we'd be around 3%. And in fact, we kind of lowered the bar a little bit for the Montana economy. We don't think oil prices are going to be getting over $100 a barrel very soon. We think the development is in a different phase with respect to energy. And we think there's a lot of issues with Montana exports, with the strong dollar, and with some of the turbulence abroad. So that's the outlook for the state. I'd be happy to stop now for a moment and take a question or two. Thank you very much.
Questions for Pat? We have a couple of microphones that are that are available moving around the room? Are there some questions or comments? Global, U.S., Montana, oil, gas? Must be a question. Speak up. Did I see a hand? Yes.
Can I jump in?
Oh, please, yeah.
What's going on in Gallatin County?
Paul can talk about this as well. What's going on in Gallatin County is that, first off, they're first out of the gate when it comes to housing recovery. It's the only part of the state that really has a full-blown residential construction recovery happening. A second part of what's going on in Gallatin County is you've got a lot of high-tech manufacturing development. You've got a lot of entrepreneurial activity because all the former owners of Right Now are sitting with a lot of money and they're starting businesses. And MSU is doing very well. And as if I'm stealing everyone's thunder because all the other presenters want to talk, make all these points, but tourism's not doing too bad either.
Okay.
There, I stole everyone's point.
There was, Micah, yes.
So even more interesting to me is what's going on in Madison County that the wages are up so high.
Madison is a smaller county, so a lot of the wages are up in Madison because those people work in Gallatin County. It's similar to our valley here. I mean, a lot of our valley economic activity is just geared to exactly what's going on right here in Missoula. That's a big part of it. I think there's been, Big Sky's doing pretty well. And I think the amenities there and the fact that Americans are now more mobile and those high-end prices are moving. It's a smaller county. It doesn't take as much to move the needle, but that's the story.
Other questions?
Yesterday, there was a set of comments from the head of the BP Oil with regard to what is happening to the oil industry, and he basically said he predicted the price of oil is going to remain low for at least 3 years, but he expressed the same concerns, Pat, that you did, that it's going to do some significant damage to the level of investments in the oil industry. And he was saying that the next time we have an oil shortage and prices go up, he was predicting about $200 per barrel. So in a way, if we continue with this trend, are we setting ourselves up for a big crash maybe within the next 3 to 5 years?
I'm tempted to make a joke there because I know not of it. Of course, oil prices go up and down. That's what always happens. It's been the essence of that market. There's a lot of reasons why. It's commodity. It's worldwide commodity. When expectations change, prices change in a hurry. And there's always over and under correction. So in some sense, that question is answered by historical experience. $200 a barrel? Sure, I'd say it'd be $200 a barrel. Didn't say when.
Other questions? We have time for at least one more. If not, thank you, Pat. Pat will be with us. Obviously, Pat will be with us for the rest of the day, so if you have other questions for him, collar him at a break or at lunch. We want to turn now to look at not just economic activity in the Missoula area, but we want to examine some regional changes and compare them to Missoula within Montana, and in line with this year's energy theme, look at some of the impacts of the Bakken oil developments around the state. And to do that, would you please welcome the Director Emeritus of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Paul Polzin.
How do you like that archival picture that they found? The Trib used to have a very old picture of mine, and every time they would run an economic story, they'd stick this picture in. And Governor Roscoe would always call me the next Monday and say, "How did you get the Trib to publish your confirmation picture?" You know, it's 2015. It's 8 years after the recession began. People are still talking about the Great Recession. I don't know if it's going to be like the Great Depression, which my folks talked about for 50 years, but it certainly is a major, major economic event, and it provides a good starting point to measure things. Now, when we look at economic trends throughout Montana, beginning with the recession, in other words, we're looking at a little longer period than Pat was looking at earlier, we start to see some very definite trends. Here's Montana, beginning in 2008. That was the depth of recession. You can see that the actual trough in the recession here in Montana was in late 2009 and a little bit in 2010. We have had growth in Montana since the recession, but it's been very spotty and very jumpy. Now let's start looking at the various parts of Montana, and let's start with the western region. Now over this longer term period, the western part of Montana has actually been the slower growing region. Here's Missoula. You can see the kinds of the trend here. First of all, the recession was really not too bad here in Missoula. But then came the recovery, and what happened? Not really very much. Only in the last year, late 2013 and early 2014, have we seen an upturn. Now, as slow as things were here in Missoula, they were even slower down in Ravalli County. You can see down in Ravalli County there was a significant decline during the recession, probably because of the recreational home market down there. And it's only been, again, in the last several years, or late 2013, that we see any kind of an uptick in Ravalli County. Kalispell, a little different trend there too. Significant recession impact, but actually quite significant growth in Kalispell since the recession trough. Now let's look at three cities that have had basically a non-cyclic response. Here's Montana again. Here's Cascade County, that's Great Falls. Here's Lewis and Clark County, that is Helena. And here's Butte Silver Bow. The thing that these three counties or these three communities have in common is basically the recession was a non-issue there, but also growth since the recession has been very slow. There's no marked recovery. There's an easy explanation for Cascade County and Helena because they're government towns, and government tends to be a very non-cyclic industry. In Butte Anaconda, it's a little different because natural resources are a major part of their economic base. But Montana Resources, which operates the mine in Silver Bow County, has been a very non-cyclic trend over the last several years. Next, we have two communities that have probably been outperforming the state. The first is Yellowstone County, that's Billings. The one-liner with Yellowstone County is it's probably receiving the indirect impact of the Bakken. And there's Gallatin County. Notice it has had a significant recovery since the recession. And you see that big blip there about 2012? That's the sale of Right Now Technology, which showed up in terms of wage payments. Okay, we've looked at 7 communities across Montana. Most of them were at or below the statewide average. So where is the growth, or where was the growth over this longer period? Mostly in eastern Montana, but in order to look at that growth, we have to do a little statistical trick. Look at the left-hand scale. I've enlarged that left-hand scale. So instead of looking at 10 or 20% growth, I'm now looking at 200% growth. This makes Montana look a lot more stable, or you don't see the growth quite as well. There is Richland County. That's where the growth has been up until recently. There is Roosevelt County, just to the northwest of Richland County. And we probably would be hearing more about Roosevelt County if this we would have heard more if there had not been a decline in the price of oil. Let's look at Missoula. Here's Missoula's economic base. These are the basic industries here in Missoula, exactly analogous to those basic industries that Pat talked about at the state. These are the drivers of the Missoula economy. Now let's start with construction. Construction is really not a basic industry, but it's been one of the major players in the last business cycle. And the thing about construction is that it's been very slow to recover here in Missoula. We do have a number of commercial and industrial projects, some of them here at the university, some of them out on the south side. But the big problem with Missoula construction has been the lack of residential construction. It is still bumping along the bottom that was experienced during the recession. The university and other state government, they are now the largest component of Missoula's economic base. The enrollment trends here at the university have not been too favorable, but the local economic impact of the university has continued to grow, primarily because of increased research. Missoula is a medical center. People come to Missoula to see a doctor, a dentist, and other medical services. The big uncertainty now is what will the Sales Community Medical Center do to Missoula's role as a regional medical center. The federal government, not good here. Over the past several years, over the past 5 years, we've seen small but significant declines in the federal government across Montana, including here in Missoula. Professional services, that's one bright spot. We continue to have accountants, architects, and other professional service organizations locate here in Missoula that service clients throughout western Montana. Transportation, that's basically railroads and trucking, energy growth there. Non-resident travel, we will probably continue to see that industry grow modestly as the U.S. economy recovers. The wood products industry, it is just a shell of what it used to be as recently as 10 years ago. But on the other hand, it has been increasing. As the U.S. economy is recovering, the demand for construction material and wood products has grown. Retail and Wholesale Trade Center. This represents the Missoula firms who service businesses throughout western Montana, and it also represents those people from Kalispell and elsewhere in rural areas that come to Missoula to shop. We've had increased stores, increased retail opportunities in both places like Hamilton and Kalispell, so we are now experiencing fewer people coming to Missoula to shop. So how does this kind of translate into our forecast? Here we have the last 4 or 5 years in Missoula, and you can get, it's a prime example of the long-term, relatively slow growth in Missoula. It's all been less than 2%. That really stands out when we start comparing the last 5 years to what was going on right before the recession, when we were experiencing 3 to 5% annual growth. Here's our forecast. We're looking for more acceleration in terms of economic growth over the next couple of years. The real uncertainty continues to be residential construction, however. If we don't get a significant turnaround in residential construction, these figures are probably a little bit too high. Now, when we go down to Ravalli County, we see that the biggest basic industry in Ravalli County is really the commuters who live in Ravalli County but work in Missoula. But starting again with construction, again, construction has been a very slow, it's been really hard hit in Ravalli County, and there has not been any recovery recently. Probably you're getting a slight positive influence from the commuters because as things improve in Missoula, that also impacts their local spending in Ravalli County. Medical research, that's GlaxoSmithKline and also the Rocky Mountain Lab. They continue to have modest growth, especially in GlaxoSmithKline, and the Rocky Mountain Lab appears to be stable. The federal government, again, not good news because of the overall decline. Manufacturing, this is the bright spot in Ravalli County. The firearms industry is now a major component of the economic base in Ravalli County. Wood products, again, much smaller, but some increases in trend, or some recent increases. Here's our forecast, or here's the recent trend in terms of Ravalli County. The thing to notice is that there were declines in Ravalli County as recent as 2011. We've had some increases in growth in 2013 and 2014. Most of that has to do with some modest expansion at GlaxoSmithKline. Here's our forecast for the next several years. And again, the major uncertainty is in terms of residential construction. If there is no rebound in residential construction, these figures, too, may be slightly too high. When we look across the state, this reinforces what Pat was talking about. We have all of the cities at or near the statewide average, except for Gallatin County. We notice that Ravalli County, Missoula County, and Flathead County are at or near the statewide average. But remember, all of these western counties are gradually crawling out of a deep recession hole. So the recent growth rates have a ways to go before we overcome what happened in these cities during the recession. Now, when we chose energy as our theme, we knew that it was going to be a hot topic. But we really didn't realize how much of a hot topic it was going to be, because it's just dominating the press. The big news, of course, is the drop in oil prices and gasoline. Since last July, crude oil prices have dropped by more than 50%. The latest figures are crude oil is somewhere south of $50 a barrel. I keep changing the slide every couple of days because newer data comes in. Gasoline prices continue to plummet. They were $3.50 last summer. Now they're less than $2 a gallon. And that's not only here in Missoula, but statewide. And again, these are figures that I keep updating daily. How come? Well, the answer is really very simple. We've had a dramatic increase in the supply of crude oil here worldwide. And this is a graph you'll be seeing over and over, or portions of this graph you'll be seeing over and over again today. Why have prices declined? Supply has increased at the same time as demand, which is determined by worldwide economic conditions, is not doing very well. So when you have an increase in supply, a very little increase in demand, what happens to price? Price goes down. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Well, there aren't a lot of people out there who've made a lot of correct projections about what's going to happen to price. And we're right in there, too. But if we can't project what's going to happen to price, we can at least look at what determines future price trends. And there are probably three things that determine what's going to happen to oil prices in the future. First of all, what will oil producers do? Now, traditionally, oil producers take a long-run viewpoint, and they view price declines as being somewhat short-term. But it depends on how long they think that this price decline is going to last. If they view this price decline as lasting for a long time, as Pat shows, they're going to be decreasing their investment, and that's going to be a moderation in terms of the U.S. and world oil production. Second, again, reinforcing those things that Pat talked about. One of the things that's going to determine what happens to world oil prices is what happens to the world economy. How fast do we get out of this world economic funk that's affecting most of the world besides the U.S.? And the third thing is political instability. All we really need is a major shock in Libya, in Iraq, or in Iran, and we will see a major change in terms of oil prices. So these are the three things, and the interplay between these three things are what's going to determine future oil prices. But even though we're not going to make a projection, some other people have. Here I've got two forecasts for the price of oil, one by the U.S. Energy Information Agency and the other by IHS Global Insight. Notice that they both forecast a trough in the oil price during 2015 of somewhere around $40 a barrel. And then they're forecasting, or at least IHS Global Insight, a slow recovery of oil prices. And according to them, we're not going to be reaching $90 a barrel again until about 2019. But before you take these forecasts too seriously, remember that neither of these organizations correctly forecast the decline in prices that's occurred in the last 6 months. But anyway, these are the forecasts that are sitting out there. Now, why are oil prices so important here in Missoula? We're 600 miles away from the oil activity over in eastern Montana and Sydney. Well, the reason why they're important is, believe it or not, what happens in the Bakken affects us right here in Missoula. So let's start off by kind of looking at the time trend. What's been going on in the Bakken? So here we got employment in Richland County, that's Sidney, and Williams County, that's Williston, just on the other side of the border. So what happened during the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s? Basically nothing. What happened in 2009 or 2007 to 2009? We start seeing the rustling of a little bit of increase in activity. But we see what happened after 2009. Dramatic increases, much more so in North Dakota than in Montana. Now, the thing to keep in mind as we start looking at some other numbers later on is that the growth actually is very recent, 2011, 12, and 13. And notice that the growth in North Dakota has been much bigger than the growth here in Montana. Most people pretty much agree that it's not caused by differences in taxes. It's caused by differences in the deposits, caused by differences in the companies that are involved, but the tax factor does not seem to be a major determinant of these differences in trends. Now, who supplies the oil industry? Well, a recent report out of the American Petroleum Institute identified over 300 firms that were identified as vendors to the oil industry. Here's a map that shows their physical location across Montana. Notice that they're located all over the place. Now, believe it or not, that map is proportional to the number of firms. So the dot for the firms really is larger in Billings than it is elsewhere. You can't really see it. But what I did then was just reformatted that information, and I identified the number of firms by zip code. And notice that here in the Missoula area, we've got 12 firms that have been identified as vendors to the oil industry. Notice that there's about 118 firms in our major cities across the state. There's another 100 firms outside of these major areas that have been identified as vendors to the oil industry. Now, not only are firms across the state affected by the oil industry, we've got people across the state that work in the oil industry. Now, here is data from 2011. Remember, 2011 is just the beginning of the expansion. Here we got people that work in the oil fields that live in the various communities around the state. And here in Missoula and Ravalli County in 2011, notice that we had 56 people working in eastern Montana. This is the far eastern corner. This is Richland County, Fallon County, and Roosevelt County. And western North Dakota, those are the 4 big counties that are in western North Dakota. So there are a significant number of people who live in western Montana who work there, and it's probably much more now than there was in 2011. Now, the final question then is just how big is the Bakken? How important is it? Well, one way we can look at that is by looking at employment in Richland County and also the 4 counties in western Montana. In 2010, before this started, there were 41,000. In 2013, there were 77,000, or an increase of about 36,000 jobs in that area. How does that compare? Flathead County's got about 59,000 workers, Gallatin County about 70,000 workers, and Yellowstone County about 102,000. So compared to the other counties in Montana, this is sizable. But now let's do exactly the same calculation, but look in terms of income now rather than employment. You can see that income in these areas rose from about $2.6 billion to $6.2 billion in 2013, or a growth of about $3.5 billion. Again, comparing it to counties in Montana, notice that that $6.2 million is greater than Flathead County, greater than Gallatin County, almost equal to Yellowstone County, and I threw in Burleigh County, North Dakota, which is Bismarck, to give some idea of how big the Bakken is compared to the second largest city in North Dakota. So no matter how you measure it in terms of employment or in terms of income, the Bakken area represents a significant economic entity. So with that, I'd like to close. Maybe you've got some more questions for Pat, and maybe I can try and answer some of your questions.
you bring the lights up? Thank you. Questions for Paul or Pat? Comments? A lot of material. There must be some questions. We have microphones here. Comments? Questions? Going once?
Just to build a little bit on what's going on in Gallatin, the residential market, primarily in Big Sky, has been what's driving that increase in construction down in Rhode County. Yeah.
Just a quick question. I'm curious, you talk a lot about wages and growth and that kind of thing, but what do you anticipate the impacts of inflation on all of this to be, both from a national view of inflation and then maybe within Montana?
What is the outlook for inflation? When we look at the forecasting agencies, the outlook for inflation is actually very benign. We've had very expansive monetary policy over the last decade, and people are sort of waiting for that to find its way into inflation. But it just simply hasn't shown up yet. And the forecasts are for continued about 2% inflation over the next couple of years. Whether something more happens over the long run, I don't know. But at least the short-term forecasts are fairly benign.
Here's one, Paul.
Yeah, it is working. For Missoula County, I'm just trying to get a sense of the decline in prices of oil prices, if that's a positive or a negative. It's obviously a negative for the eastern part of the state, and it's obviously a positive for consumers in the western part of the state. You showed some numbers that indicated how many people from this part of the state work in North Dakota or the eastern part of the state. And I've always had a sense for the last year or so that the labor market here is pretty tight. So it struck me that a lot of people would be moving back. If there's a decline or a collapse in drilling and maybe even production in the east. So this could well be a positive for Missoula, and I don't know if that's an answerable question or not. But any comments on that or your thoughts on that?
What's the net impact on Missoula County from the decline in oil prices?
Especially the labor markets.
Well, I would say probably the net impact is a plus because we got a lot more people buying gas than we do working or indirectly impacted by the Bakken. But my point, I think, was more is that we are not independent of what's going on in the eastern part of the state. So that's probably the way I would address that.
That's true, and I also know a lot of people, and I guess you've shown that a lot of people have moved there, at least temporarily, to work. Any sense of how many would have to come back? I mean, this is probably not forecastable. I don't know.
Come on back next year. I'm waiting for that data that I gave for 2011. I'm hoping is going to be updated next year, so we got stuff for 2012 and 2013.
Okay,
that's
great.
basically the source of where I got some of this migration stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, we have time for one more. Yes. Oh. Is that Terry?
Thanks, Paul. Back here.
No, we got.
We'll take two more. Jim, go. Yeah.
Oh, we got to talk to a dean first.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Is there any possibility of a bust in the Bakken? That is, it takes maybe $90 a barrel to be able to get that oil out, and they just say this isn't worth it if oil stays at $50 a barrel for 5 or 10 years.
Is there a real possibility of a bust? Yeah, there's always a real possibility, but use that same question later on when we talk to Bill Whitston. I will just throw a couple of things out, is that I was looking at some stuff that's coming out of North Dakota. We are right at the beginning of this technology of shale extraction, and costs are plummeting. And we're now looking, there are a couple of counties in North Dakota that have reported extraction costs in the $30 to $40 range. That's far different than the $70 to $80 range that we're talking about earlier. So we're going to have to wait and see how that plays out.
One more, Paul.
Okay.
Terry had a question.
Okay.
I was surprised when you said that the residential construction hasn't grown in Missoula. Assuming apartment buildings are residential, it seems like there's new huge ones on every corner right now. And I'm
What?
wondering who's going to
Yeah,
move into them? Who's going to rent them?
Residential market seems to be, I mean, the multifamily seems to be doing much better. Wait about 10 minutes or 20 minutes till Sue LaRue comes up. And she's got a great answer to that.
Paul, can you go back to the slide about your projection of the rebound in oil prices
to that $60 to $80 a barrel range?
Yeah, you can look at it in your.
How did you determine that rebound, and how soon can that happen?
Okay, that's not my forecast. That's IHS Global Insights forecast. And like I say, before you really get too excited about it, remember that their track record in terms of oil price projections has not been very good. So that, I suppose what their logic is the slowly recovering world economy.
Thank you, Paul. Paul will also obviously be with us for the rest of the day, so if you have other questions, you can collar him at the break or elsewhere. We want to begin now to look at major industries that are important to Montana and the Montana economy. And to begin, we want to look at significant trends in Montana's healthcare industries. And to do that, I'm going to introduce our in the Bureau, our Director of Healthcare Research. Would you please welcome Bryce Ward.
Thanks, Chuck. So I really like how Pat started off the day talking about how things have changed since 1976. 1976 is a very important year in my life. I was a very healthy 10-pound, 11-ounce newborn. Yes, my mother is a saint. And now I am this mental giant that you see before you, ready to impart my wisdom about the healthcare economy to you. I did have one problem, though. Pat kept saying that was 40 years ago. It's maybe the 40th seminar, but I want to be very, very clear that I don't turn 40 until next year. So I'm going to hang on to this last year in my 30s. So I'm new. Some of you saw me last year on my less than 24 hours after I moved to Missoula and before I'd actually officially started working at the university. This is my first year actually preparing this talk. And it's a little weird to do an outlook for healthcare because, and it's weird for two big reasons. So typically either the explicit or the subtext question of an outlook presentation is this sector going to grow? And as a healthcare economist, I think we've stopped asking ourselves that question. I can honestly say I've spent 0 minutes of my career wondering whether or not healthcare was going to grow. Healthcare grows. If I could put up a little chart that shows you, look, this is employment growth in healthcare over the last 25 years. It's like this. It's just a straight line going up. And if you squint at it, you can see some little squiggles here and there. But in every year since 1990, employment in the healthcare sector nationally has grown by over 1.5%. It has not had a recession. It slows down. But it doesn't slow down into negative territory, right? So the question we ask in healthcare is not is the sector going to grow, but is it going to grow really fast or just fast? And the second weird thing about giving an outlook talk for healthcare is that the preferred answer of the healthcare economist is not super fast, right? We prefer only merely fast, right? Because with healthcare, unlike the other parts of this program, you actually need to ask a follow-up question before you decide if a growing sector is evidence of a good thing or a bad thing. In particular, you need to ask, well, why is this sector growing? Because if healthcare is growing because we're all sicker, that's probably not a good thing. Or if it's growing because it's inefficient, right? We're not getting health, sufficient improvements in health to justify the increase in spending, that's also not a good thing, right? And so, the healthcare economist is the somewhat rare economist who doesn't spend his time trying to think, oh, well, why does this sector grow and how do we make it grow faster? We actually spend our time trying to make it grow slower. So that's a little weird. So this part of the program will have a little different rhythm probably than the rest of the day. And that, we're not going to focus on is the sector going to grow, but is the sector getting better? And by better, I mean, is it doing the things, is it trying to solve the big problems that have long plagued our healthcare system? Lack of access, unaffordably fast healthcare spending growth, and insufficient quality for the amount that we spend. Right? So we've actually made some really interesting progress in each of these areas, so that's what I'm going to highlight today. So first up is access. So I've long remarked that the Affordable Care Act should be referred to as the Access to Care Act because the meatiest provisions in the Affordable Care Act had to do with giving people health insurance. And in 2014 was the year in which those things started to really go into effect, and so it's natural to ask the question, well, what happened? We saw a decline in the rate of people, or the share of people who lacked health insurance. And, we're still getting the data, and it will come in over time. But, the early estimates that we have suggest that the uninsured rate declined by about 5 percentage points nationally. which means about 10 to 12 million people got health insurance that otherwise wouldn't have had it. It's harder to talk about what happened in Montana. Gallup gave us this estimate in mid-year, about July, which showed that Montana had seen a 2.8 percentage point decline in its uninsured rate. However, the way that Gallup does the survey is they're out there surveying every day, and so by mid-year, they really don't have a whole lot of observations in Montana. So the margin of error around this estimate is plus or minus 5 percentage points. So we actually can't say if it's gone down at all with any kind of degree of statistical precision. But if we kind of accept the Gallup estimate as, kind of the best thing that we have available, say, well, okay, let's half year what happened in the rest of the year. So the evidence suggests that it likely went down by a little bit more over the last half of the year, but it's unlikely that Montana saw the same decreases as we see nationally, because states that didn't expand Medicaid, like Montana, experienced smaller decreases in the share of people who are uninsured. So, we'll see where the numbers ultimately come out, but I wouldn't expect it to be as big as the 5 percentage point that we saw nationally. Now, it's important to note that we're not done, right? The first year, we have the exchanges, we have Medicaid expansion, blah, blah, blah. But, we've always projected that it's going to take a little bit of time for this to reach a new equilibrium. And so, here we are, we're kind of the first year in, and the Congressional Budget Office and other health economists project that we're going to continue to see declines over the next couple years before we kind of reach this new stable point. That's access. We've made some real progress in access, but we're going to, if the ACA stays around, we'll expect to continue to see the share of people without health insurance declining over the next few years. The second big story of the year is cost, right? So we've seen this real slowdown in healthcare spending growth. And it goes back to about 2009, right? You can see it in the chart there, right? So we've had kind of sub 4 percentage point growth in 4 of the last 5 years. And in 2013, the last year which we have full data, healthcare spending only grew at 3.6%, which, since the federal government has been tracking this statistic in 1960, that's the lowest we've ever seen, right? So, that's a big deal. And it's a big deal for lots of reasons. First is, this ultimately does show up in the premiums that you pay. The Kaiser Family Foundation has been doing a survey on figuring out what the average family premium for people with employer-sponsored health insurance is, and these are the results. The top line is the family premium, and you can see that in the early part of this decade, it was growing by a whole lot more than the economy, which is or the earnings or inflation, which are the other two lines. And then, in 2014, the last year in which we have data, it grew by a little bit more than the economy, but not by nearly as much more. And that's the lowest year that they've ever, the lowest increase that they've observed as well. We also saw this a little bit in the health insurance exchanges, right? I think most economists were pleasantly surprised that that price growth in the new exchanges hasn't been as substantial as we might have expected. And so, since most of you probably don't interact with the exchanges, I thought I'd show you how much it costs to buy a silver plan without subsidies in the different markets here in Montana. So in Missoula, if you bought the cheapest plan last year and you wanted to renew it this year, it's going to cost you $266 a month before subsidies. If you're willing to switch, and this is one of the big important lessons that we've learned, you can actually lower your costs and end up cheaper than what you paid last year by paying only $238, which represents a 2 percentage point decline in what the lowest cost silver plan was last year in Missoula. So, and given that most people who enter the exchanges actually aren't renewal, but actually people who flow in and out of group insurance and non-group insurance, we actually seen a price decline, at least in this kind of benchmark plan. So that's good for families. It's also really good for the federal government. Half of every dollar that goes into our healthcare system flows through our federal government. And when you talk about, we have these discussions all the time about problems with with our fiscal situation and long-term budget deficits and long-term debt. That's all a healthcare problem, right? That's really the only thing that's going on that's Medicare, Medicaid, and other federal health spending. And so if you went back in time to 2011, kind of the first year post-ACA, and you look at what the Congressional Budget Office projected the federal government was going to spend over the next 10 years on healthcare, and you compared it to what they projected last year, right? We've already seen a $900 billion cumulative savings in healthcare spending due to the healthcare slowdown. Just to put $900 billion in context, you may also recall that in 2011 was an interesting year in D.C. We spent the year first with a debt ceiling crisis, and then with this thing called the super committee, and then we ended up with sequestration. And the total amount of savings by 2021, the same year that we're ending our projections here, that's due to sequestration was $1.1 trillion. So kind of unbeknownst to Washington during that whole fight, kind of going on, underneath the surface was cuts to spending that they didn't have to do anything about that ultimately almost equaled the amount of the sequester. Right, so healthcare spending slowdown is a big deal. It's an important deal. Now the question is it going to keep going? And that's harder to say. A lot of economists think that this slowdown is really just, it's a lingering byproduct of the weakness in the economy. And there's some evidence to support that. However, as each year that goes by, that we see slower spending growth is a year that we kind of have to start wondering about. And if you look at, we don't have full data for 2014, but you look at some of the early indicators for 2014, like employment and payroll and healthcare, and they haven't spiked up again. In fact, they've grown at roughly the rates that we saw in 2013. And in Montana, at least the preliminary data for healthcare employment growth is less than 1 percentage point, which is the lowest that it's been since at least the turn of the century. So we're still continuing to see this healthcare spending slowdown, but we're not going to accept that it's real yet. We're going to keep trying to figure out ways to make our healthcare system better. Right? And that's the third big story of the year is, we're continuing to try and figure out ways to make the healthcare system better and more efficient. And that means basically two things. Right? It means we're trying to figure out how to reduce price or reduce quantity, or when we talk about quantity, at least get more value for the quantity of care that we provide. And there's lots of things that are going on right now that are targeted at both of these things. Some of them are kind of the little talked about aspects of the ACA, and some of them are just things that are going on independently. I'm going to highlight two things that we got results for this year. First, and on the price side, economists have long been driven crazy by healthcare prices, or their lack thereof. Let me illustrate my own experience. When I first graduated, got my PhD, and one of my first things I worked on was an antitrust case involving MRIs. At the time, it was really uncommon to know what health insurance providers actually paid doctors for different procedures. And because it was a litigation context, we got to subpoena this stuff and actually see the data. It blew my little young economist mind. You just out of graduate school, you think, oh, markets work, and then, everything's great. And then, you look at this data, and there were two providers. They were 2 blocks apart. They used the exact same radiology group to read the MRIs, and their technology was essentially the same. And yet one was charging 50% more than the other one. And the one that was charging 50% more was rapidly gaining market share. That's just not supposed to happen. When you took EC 10 or EC 101 or whatever you want to call it, that's not what they taught you. Same quality, lower price means you win, not in healthcare. And one of the big reasons, or the lessons that I took away from that was part of the problem may be the fact that nobody knows how much healthcare costs. I had gotten my own MRI literally right before I did this case. And the doctor said, go get an MRI. And he signed me up, and I went there, and I paid my 10% copay and went about my business. Only afterwards, like, wait, I probably should have shopped around because I could have saved myself some money. So we don't have the data for Missoula, but we do have it for Denver. This is the price of a lower back MRI in network within the Denver area, right? So, essentially the same procedure. You can get it for $945, you can get it for $2,700, right? It is common that you'll see 300% differences in the cost of MRIs within the same market. Most people don't know that. So Blue Cross and Blue Shield decided, hey, what would happen if we told people this? So they took some markets and they said, look, we're going to tell people in this market how much MRIs cost at different places. And in other markets, we're just going to, leave them alone. And this is what happened, right? In the group that actually found out information, prices actually fell. And in the markets where they didn't give information, prices rose. And so if you kind of take the decline and assume that they would have grown by the amount their reference group is, we saw about a $220 net impact from making the prices available, which amounts to about a 10%, decline in, or actually a 20% decline in the price of MRI. So this is good news to economists. It warms my heart to see that price transparency might actually help. Now we just actually have to achieve it, which is really hard. So the second area that we've seen some progress in is in quality. Right, so for a long time, another project I worked on early in my career was on medical errors and the economic costs of them. They're really big. Lots of people die. Lots of people get injured by medical care. And so recently we've started, both as part of the ACA and independently, we've started to change that. Right? So some of this is incentive-driven. So Medicare, insurance companies won't pay for readmissions. They won't pay for certain errors. And some of this is just the hospitals and the doctors saying, we need to do better and figuring out how to design systems. And so we've seen some improvement. Right? So the readmission rate has declined. If you look at the number of hospital-acquired conditions, this is the number of people who get sick by going to the hospital. Cumulatively, between 2011 and 2013, we've experienced about a 1.3 million incident decline, which amounts to about 50,000 fewer people dying from going to the hospital. So that's big. This is important. This is good stuff. So, these are small and there's still a long ways to go, but it's encouraging to see that we're actually starting to make some progress in some of these areas. We're, improving access, restraining costs, hopefully, and, figuring out ways to make quality and cost improvements more sustainable. Real quickly, to finish up, I just want to talk about the two things lurking in healthcare in Montana. The two big things are Medicaid expansion and King versus Burwell. So Medicaid expansion obviously is whether or not the legislature chooses to accept the Medicaid expansion envisioned by the ACA and make Medicaid available to people with incomes up to 138% of the poverty line. King versus Burwell, it's a Supreme Court case which will decide whether or not people who get in health insurance through a federally created exchange actually get the subsidies that go along with it. And the effects on the industry in Montana are pretty much the same. They're just different magnitude, right? So with Medicaid expansion and King versus Burwell, the estimates that are out there suggest that about 100,000 people in 2016 wouldn't have health insurance if both of these things, or if we don't expand Medicaid and the plaintiffs win in King versus Burwell. And that means about over $450 million a year in federal subsidies that won't come into healthcare in Montana, right? So you can then start doing all the ripple effects from that. So those are the big things that are lurking that, I know give hospital administrators hearts palpitations. But that's what's going to, certainly will shape how healthcare operates in Montana going forward. And with that, I'll move to questions.
Questions for Bryce? Comments? A lot going on in healthcare. Questions? Here we go, Bryce.
You mentioned that deductibles have, or that healthcare premiums have gone down, but I wonder what deductibles and max out-of-pocket costs and cost share splits have done.
So, yeah, they've been going up. And they've been going for a long time. In fact, that's one of the hypotheses for the cost slowdown and part of the reason why price transparency may be really important. It doesn't fully offset it. It's kind of, when you take how much people actually spend and you take the premiums, we have experienced a slowdown in actual, what people are spending. But you're right, it does offset some of the deduction, the reduction in premiums is the fact that, you're shifting to higher deductible, less generous plans is part of the fact that, the early part of the graph where it was growing so much quicker.
Over here, Bryce.
I had almost an identical question. It's funny, but I was just curious if you have a figure of or access to two numbers, like what the average Montanan pays for deductible and then what the average deductible is for an ACA or marketplace plan, because in my personal experience, they were quite high.
Yeah, they can be. And part of that's picking, with the plans you.
Do you know what the lowest one is?
I off the top of my head, no, I don't know.
I think it's 3,600.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what those are. Yeah, I won't try and rack my brain. I have too many other numbers.
I was just curious. That's all I had seen.
The data are out there. I don't know about Montana specifically, but you can certainly find data on, on the different deductibles and the different plans. So, so yeah, it's out there. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay.
Other questions for Bryce?
I'm just curious if you've given this presentation in Washington, D.C., because what we hear in the media is that the Affordable Care Act is an unmitigated disaster, and yet what you've been able to show is that it seems like it's succeeding.
Well, it depends on which media you encounter. I think there's two camps of media. There's the media that are like, oh, it's a great success, and the media that it's an unmitigated disaster. How you define success is, ultimately up to you. But if you just say, look, let's just look at the problems that we had 8 years ago when I first started teaching healthcare economics, we have made some progress to solving them. And, it's, certainly the Affordable Care Act is helping on the access part. On the rest of it, we'll have to wait and see.
One more. Yes.
Hey, Bryce, thank you very much. I thought I heard Paul Polzin say that you guys are going to take this show on the road to the legislature soon?
Yes.
Yeah. I just have one favor. When you do that presentation, would you be part of it, and would you pause on that slide? right?
Yeah, this
Because-
will certainly be part of what do we talk about. I guess, I haven't given this talk before. This is the first time I've given this talk. So, but yeah, I will give it again. And obviously, when you talk to the legislature, I think this is the one that we have to talk about because
Yeah.
it's the thing that they actually have, a decision to make about.
Yeah. How many people think this is the most popular slide in Bryce's presentation?
All right.
Okay, thank you, Bryce.
All right.
Again, Bryce will be with us for the rest of the day, so if you want to discuss it further, there'll be ample opportunities.